He said the baby wasn't his, and I believed him right up until the lawyer cleared his throat. That was the moment everything inside me went quiet. Not peaceful, not calm, just hollow, like someone had reached in and scooped out every sound I'd ever known. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The lawyer's office had tall windows that let in a tired afternoon light, the kind that made dust dance slowly in the air. My hands were folded in my lap, fingers pressed together so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. Across from me, my husband's sister dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't really need. On the other side, his mother sat stiff-backed, lips pursed, already bracing herself for something she thought she understood. I was the only one who didn't know what was coming. When the lawyer began to read, his voice was steady, practiced. He spoke of accounts and properties, of sentimental items and charitable donations. I heard my name once or twice, but it barely registered. My heart was thudding too loudly in my ears. Then he paused. "There is an additional provision," he said, adjusting his glasses, "regarding the minor child, Samuel." I felt it before I understood it. A tightening in my chest, a small, sharp breath I hadn't meant to take. The baby wasn't his. That's what my husband, Raymond, had said, over and over again, with that same tired sigh, that same look of disappointment that somehow made me feel like I was the one who had failed him. But now, as the lawyer continued reading, the truth unfolded in black and white. Raymond had acknowledged Samuel as his son, not just privately, not in some forgotten note, but legally, intentionally, with forethought. I stared at the carpet, its neat blue pattern blurring as tears filled my eyes. My stomach twisted, not with triumph, not even relief, but with a deep, aching grief for all the years I had spent carrying a lie that wasn't mine. Before all of that, before lawyers and wills and whispered judgments, my life was simple in ways I didn't appreciate at the time. Raymond and I had been married for 12 years when I found out I was pregnant. We lived in a modest 2-story house on a quiet street where the maple trees arched over the road like old friends leaning in to talk. The paint on our porch was starting to peel, and the kitchen faucet had a drip we never quite fixed, but it was home. It smelled like coffee in the mornings and clean laundry on Sundays. Raymond worked long hours as a regional sales manager for an industrial supply company. He wore crisp button-down shirts and kept his hair neatly combed, even on weekends. He liked routine. Same breakfast every morning, same chair in the living room, same news channel at night. I used to think that steadiness meant safety. I worked part-time at the local library. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved the quiet order of it, the way stories sat patiently on shelves waiting to be discovered. I liked helping people find what they were looking for, even when they didn't quite know how to ask. We had tried for years to have a child. Doctor's visits, tests, awkward conversations whispered late at night. When it didn't happen, Raymond had grown distant in a way that was hard to name. Not cruel, just withdrawn. He spent more time at work, more time scrolling through his phone with his back turned to me. So when I finally saw those 2 pink lines, my hands shook so badly I had to sit down on the edge of the bathtub. I told him that evening, standing in the kitchen while the pasta water boiled over because I'd forgotten to turn down the heat. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stared at me for a long moment, too long. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He asked, "Are you sure?" That should have been my first clue. The pregnancy was hard. I was tired all the time, nauseous in the mornings, my back aching by the end of my shifts at the library. Raymond came to some of the appointments, but he always checked his phone, always seemed distracted. When the doctor talked about due dates and heartbeats, Raymond nodded politely, like a guest listening to someone else's good news. His mother, Clara, was worse. She had always been particular. Everything in her house had a place, and she had strong opinions about how things should be done. When she found out I was pregnant, she pursed her lips and said, "Well, I suppose miracles do happen." It sounded like a compliment, but it didn't feel like one. As my belly grew, so did the distance between Raymond and I. He stopped touching my stomach, stopped asking how I felt. Some nights he slept on the couch, claiming he didn't want to disturb me. I told myself he was scared. Men get scared, I'd heard. I told myself not to be sensitive. Then one night, when I was 7 months along, he said it. We were sitting at the dining table, the overhead light casting harsh shadows on his face. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "I don't think the baby is his," he flatly said. The words hit me like cold water. "What?" I asked, laughing a little because it sounded absurd. "Raymond, what are you talking about?" He finally looked up then, his eyes sharp. "I've done the math," he said. "The timing doesn't add up." My heart pounded. "That's not true," I said. "You know that's not true." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "That's what they all say," he replied. From that moment on, something inside our marriage cracked. Not all at once, slowly, quietly, like ice forming over water. And I carried that crack with me into the delivery room, into the long nights of feeding and rocking, and wondering how love could turn into suspicion so easily. At the time, I thought the worst pain would be hearing him say those words. I was wrong. The night Samuel was born, the hospital room smelt like antiseptic and something faintly metallic. My body was shaking, exhausted in a way I didn't know was possible. And when the nurse finally placed him on my chest, I cried. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but quiet tears that slid sideways into my hair. He was warm. He was real. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around mine, like he already knew me. Raymond stood near the window, hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't come closer. He didn't reach out. "Do you want to hold him?" the nurse asked, her voice soft and practiced. Raymond hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch. "Maybe later," he said. Later never came. When we brought Samuel home, the house felt different, too quiet, too careful. Raymond moved around like a guest, polite and distant. He slept in the spare bedroom so the baby's crying wouldn't keep him up. He referred to Samuel as the baby, never by his name. His mother visited once, standing stiffly by the crib with her arms crossed. She leaned in, squinted at Samuel's face, and then straightened. "He doesn't look like Raymond," she said, not unkindly, just matter of fact. "Babies change," I wanted to say. "He's barely a week old." But the words lodged in my throat. Raymond brought up the paternity test again when Samuel was 2 months old. He did it casually, over breakfast, stirring his coffee with too much force. "If there's nothing to hide," he said, "then it shouldn't be a problem." I stared at the toast on my plate, burnt at the edges. "You already know the truth," I said. "You just don't want to accept it." He shrugged. "I want proof." So we did it. The clinic was small and impersonal, white walls, plastic chairs, a television murmuring in the corner. The technician swabbed Samuel's cheek gently, then mine, then Raymond's. Samuel fussed, his face turning red, and I rocked him, whispering softly. The results came back 2 weeks later. Raymond didn't open the envelope right away. He set it on the counter and left it there for hours, like it might explode if touched. When he finally read it, his face went blank. "Negative," he said simply. I felt the floor tilt. "What?" He slid the paper across the counter. I read it twice, my hands trembling. Probability of paternity, 0%. "That's impossible," I whispered. Raymond didn't yell, he didn't gloat, he just nodded slowly, like something had finally clicked into place. "I knew it," he said. I called the clinic that same day, then another, then another. We repeated the test, twice more, different labs, different technicians. Same result. I couldn't understand it. I still can't, not fully. Biology is a strange, imperfect science, and there are explanations the doctors offered, rare ones, complicated ones, but none of them mattered to Raymond. In his mind, the verdict was final. He stopped coming home for dinner, stopped asking about Samuel. When he did look at him, there was a coldness in his eyes that made my chest ache. One night, after Samuel had finally fallen asleep, I confronted him. "Even if you believe that test," I said, my voice shaking, "I didn't cheat on you." Raymond rubbed his temples. "I don't know what to believe," he said, "but I know what the paper says." "So that's it?" I asked. "You just walk away?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw regret. "I'll provide financially," he said, "but I can't pretend." Within 6 months, he filed for separation. The divorce was quiet, too quiet. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no raised voices, just paperwork and silence. Raymond's lawyer insisted on language that made it clear Samuel was not his legal responsibility. I signed because I was tired, because I wanted it over. Clara stopped calling. Raymond's sister sent one stiff text message that said, "I'm sorry things turned out this way." I moved to a smaller apartment near the library. I rocked Samuel to sleep every night, breathing in the sweet, milky smell of his skin, telling him stories about a father he wouldn't know, not lies, but softened truths. I whispered into the dark, "Some people don't know how to love." Years passed. Raymond sent checks like clockwork. He never visited, never asked for pictures. When Samuel started kindergarten, I almost sent one anyway, a picture of him in his oversized backpack, grinning proudly, but I stopped myself. I told myself we didn't need him. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I got the call. Raymond had collapsed at work, massive heart attack. He didn't make it. I sat at my kitchen table, the phone pressed to my ear long after the doctor stopped speaking. The rain tapped against the window, steady and relentless. Samuel was at school. The apartment was silent. I cried, not because I missed him, but because something final had closed. The funeral was small and formal. I sat in the back pew, hands folded, eyes forward. Clara didn't look at me. Raymond's sister glanced my way once, then looked quickly away. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, a formal envelope arrived in the mail, thick, cream-colored, my name typed neatly on the front. Inside was an invitation to the reading of Raymond's will. I almost didn't go. But something, curiosity maybe, or a quiet sense of unfinished business, pushed me out the door that afternoon, back into a room that smelled like lemon polish and old paper, and into a truth Raymond had buried deeper than any of us realized. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice steady as if he weren't dismantling a lie that had shaped nearly a decade of my life. "To be held in trust until the child reaches the age of 25, he said, "at which point the remaining balance shall be distributed directly to my son, Samuel Raymond." Clara's chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That's not possible," she snapped. "That child is not my son's." The lawyer paused, looking up calmly. "Mrs. Whitaker, the will is very clear." I felt my pulse pounding in my throat. My ears rang like I was underwater. Raymond's sister, Denise, turned to stare at me, her mouth slightly open. "You knew about this?" she whispered. I shook my head slowly. "No." The lawyer adjusted his glasses again. "There is also a letter attached to this provision. Mr. Whitaker requested it be read aloud." My stomach dropped. He unfolded a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakably Raymond's, tight, precise, controlled. "If you are hearing this," the lawyer read, "then I am no longer here to explain myself." The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner. "I denied Samuel publicly, and I regret that every day. The test results were real, but they were not the truth. I made choices years ago that complicate biology in ways I didn't want to face." My breath caught. "Samuel is my responsibility, not because of what science says, but because of what I know." Clara let out a sharp laugh. "This is ridiculous," she said. "He was confused. He was sick." The lawyer's voice didn't waver. "I know my family will resist this. I know they will look for someone to blame, but the blame is mine alone. I allowed pride to override compassion." Tears slid down my cheeks before I realized I was crying. "To my wife," the letter continued, "I am sorry for the weight I placed on your shoulders. I asked you to carry my doubt, and that was cruel." Wife? He still called me that. "Samuel deserves a life free from the shadow of my fear. This is the only way I know to give him that." The lawyer folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Silence followed, heavy, charged. Clara stood abruptly. "We will contest this," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "That child is not family." The lawyer nodded. "You're within your rights to try." I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My body felt like it was made of glass, fragile, vibrating, on the verge of shattering. Outside, the air felt too sharp in my lungs. I sat in my car for a long time before turning the key, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. The contest came, just as Clara promised. Depositions, attorneys, questions that circled the same old wounds. "Did you ever suspect infidelity?" they asked. "No," I said. "Can you explain the test results?" "No," I said again. Raymond's sister called me one evening, her voice hesitant. "I didn't know," she said. "I really didn't." "I know," I replied. The court upheld the will. The letter carried weight. Raymond had been meticulous, records, notes, quiet preparations that suggested this wasn't a last-minute change, but something he'd planned carefully. The trust was established. For the first time in years, the world seemed to exhale. When I told Samuel, I chose my words carefully. He was 9 by then, old enough to sense when something mattered. "Your father left you something," I said, sitting beside him on the couch. He looked up from his book. "Did he know me?" I swallowed. "In his own way." Samuel nodded, accepting the answer with a wisdom that startled me. "The money didn't change who we were. I kept my job, we stayed in our small apartment, but I started sleeping better. Worry loosened its grip just a little. One afternoon, months later, Clara showed up at my door. She looked smaller somehow, older. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, standing stiffly in the doorway, "but I was wrong." I studied her face, the tight mouth, the tired eyes. I thought of all the years she'd looked at my son and seen only doubt. "Raymond made his choices," I said quietly. "We all live with them." She nodded once, then turned and left. As I closed the door, Samuel's laughter drifted from the living room. I leaned my forehead against the wood, breathing deeply. Truth doesn't always come in time to heal everything, but sometimes it comes just in time to set things right. After the court decision, life didn't suddenly become lighter. It became quieter. The kind of quiet that settles in after a long storm, when you're not sure whether the clouds are gone for good or just catching their breath. Samuel grew the way children do, slowly, then all at once. One morning, his shoes didn't fit. Another afternoon, his voice cracked when he laughed. He started asking more questions, not just about Raymond, but about people in general. Why they lie, why they leave, why love doesn't always look the same from the inside as it does from the outside. I answered him honestly, but gently. People are complicated, I told him once while we washed dishes together. The warm water steamed up the window and the smell of lemon soap filled the kitchen. Sometimes they're afraid of truth they don't know how to carry. Was Dad afraid? He asked, not looking up. Yes, I said, very. That seemed to satisfy him for the moment. The trust fund paperwork arrived in thick envelopes every few months, statements, updates, careful language meant to reassure. I filed them away in a drawer I rarely opened. The money felt less like a gift and more like an apology that arrived too late to be spoken aloud. Still, it changed things in quiet ways. I enrolled Samuel in a better school when we moved to a slightly larger apartment. I replaced the old couch that sagged in the middle. I fixed the dripping faucet. Small dignities. What surprised me most was how often I found myself thinking about Raymond, not with anger, but with a kind of distant curiosity. I replayed old conversations, old silences. I wondered when he'd started preparing that will, whether he'd sat alone at night, pen in hand, wrestling with words he never gave himself permission to say out loud. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined him standing in the doorway, watching Samuel sleep, imagined regret softening his face. I didn't indulge those thoughts for long. They were dangerous. They had the power to reopen wounds that had finally begun to close. Denise and I started speaking more regularly. She'd call to check in, to ask about Samuel's soccer games or my work at the library. We avoided talking about Raymond directly, but he hovered in the space between us like an unspoken agreement. One afternoon, she asked, "Do you hate him?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "I don't think I ever did. I hated what he chose. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "I wish he'd been braver." "So do I replied. Years passed. Samuel turned 12, then 13. He grew into a thoughtful boy with a quiet sense of humor and a habit of listening more than he spoke. He carried Raymond's eyes, I realized one day, catching a glimpse of him in the mirror as he brushed his teeth. It didn't hurt the way I thought it might. On the anniversary of Raymond's death, I took Samuel to the cemetery. The sky was overcast, the air cool and damp. We stood side by side in front of a simple headstone. Samuel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Do you think he would have liked me?" he asked. I rested my hand on his shoulder. "I think he already did. He just didn't know how to show it." Samuel nodded, then surprised me by stepping forward and placing a small stone on the grave. "Just in case," he said. Something in my chest loosened. That night, after Samuel went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to prove something to Raymond, to his family, to the world, and how in the end, the truth had surfaced on its own terms. Not with fireworks, not with apologies shouted across rooms, but with ink on paper and a voice read aloud by a stranger. I realized then that vindication had never been what I wanted. I wanted peace, and for the first time I felt it settling in, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet understanding that I had done the best I could with what I was given. Some nights I still dreamed of that kitchen table, of burnt toast and ticking clocks, but the dreams no longer left me shaken. They felt like old photographs, important but no longer sharp. Life moved forward. It always does. Samuel grew into himself. I grew softer around the edges, less afraid of being misunderstood. I stopped explaining my past to people who hadn't earned it. And I learned something I wish I'd known sooner. You don't need everyone to believe the truth for it to be real. You just need to live it. The years after that settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. Not the old rhythm of waiting for someone else to believe me, to choose me, to stand beside me, but a steadier one built on what was, not what I hoped might be. Samuel started high school. The first morning, he stood in front of the mirror too long, adjusting his collar, running his fingers through his hair the way Raymond used to before big meetings. I watched from the doorway, unnoticed, my chest tightening in that familiar, complicated way. "Mom," he said suddenly, catching my reflection, "do I look okay?" "You look like yourself. That's more than okay." He smiled, grabbed his backpack, and headed out the door, leaving behind the faint smell of his shampoo and the echo of footsteps that felt both too loud and too quiet. At the library, my coworkers noticed the change in me before I did. I laughed more easily. I stopped flinching when conversations turned toward families, fathers, legacies. I no longer felt the urge to correct every assumption, to brace myself for judgment that never actually came. One afternoon, as I shelved returned books, a woman about my age struck up a conversation. We talked about our kids, about work, about the small frustrations that come with middle age. "Single mom?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "That can't be easy." "It hasn't always been," I admitted, "but it's been honest." The word surprised me as it left my mouth. Honest. It felt right. Samuel learned about the trust gradually, in pieces, as questions arose. We talked about money, about responsibility, about the difference between being provided for and being present. "Does it mean he cared?" Samuel asked one evening, sprawled on the living room floor, homework spread around him. "Yes," I said, "it does. But not enough to stay," he said quietly. I sat beside him, folding my legs under me. Sometimes people care deeply and still make choices that hurt others. Caring isn't the same as courage. He absorbed that, nodding slowly. High school brought new challenges, friendships, disappointments, the sharp edges of growing up. Through it all, Samuel carried himself with a quiet strength that made me proud in ways I couldn't fully explain. When college acceptance letters arrived, we spread them out on the kitchen table, the same table where so many hard conversations had taken place years earlier. This time, the air felt lighter. "You did this," I told him, "not money, not anyone else." He shrugged, embarrassed. "You helped." "I showed up," I corrected. "You did the work." On the day we moved him into his dorm, I stood in the parking lot, watching him carry boxes up the stairs, my heart swelling and aching all at once. As I drove home alone, the car felt too quiet, the road too empty. That night, I sat on the couch, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, old companions, once heavy with dread, now simply part of the background. I thought about Raymond again, not with bitterness, not even sadness, but with a distant compassion. He had been a man trapped by his own fear, his own need for certainty in a world that rarely offers it. His will hadn't erased the past. It hadn't fixed the nights I cried quietly so Samuel wouldn't hear. It hadn't given Samuel a father who showed up to school plays or late-night talks. But it had done something else. It had told the truth when Raymond no longer could. And in that truth, I found a strange kind of closure, not the kind that ties everything up neatly, but the kind that allows you to stop carrying what was never yours to begin with. I began volunteering more, mentoring younger women at the library who were juggling children and uncertainty and self-doubt. I never told my whole story. I didn't need to. I just listened, the way I once wished someone had listened to me. Trust yourself, I'd say, even when others don't. Years later, at Samuel's college graduation, I sat in the audience, clapping until my hands hurt. He found me in the crowd, his smile bright and unguarded, and in that moment, every difficult step felt worth it. As we hugged afterward, he whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For staying," he said. I held him a little tighter. Staying had never been the hard part. Believing in myself had been. And now, standing there in the sunlight, surrounded by noise and life and possibility, I understood something simple and profound. The truth doesn't always defend you in the moment, but given time, it has a way of standing on its own. After Samuel moved out, the apartment felt different in a way I hadn't prepared for. Not empty exactly, just quieter, like the walls themselves were learning how to listen again. I rearranged things slowly. His room stayed mostly the same at first. The faint scent of his detergent lingered on the sheets, and every now and then I'd catch myself pausing in the doorway, just standing there, letting memories wash over me. Not sad ones, whole ones. I started walking in the evenings, looping around the neighborhood as the sun dipped low and porch lights flickered on one by one. I noticed things I'd rushed past for years, the way one woman always sang while watering her plants, the old man who sat on his steps at the same time every night, nodding politely as I passed. Life was still happening, quietly, steadily. One evening, while sorting through old paperwork, I came across a thin folder tucked behind tax documents and insurance forms. Raymond's handwriting was on the tab. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Inside were copies of letters he'd never sent. Drafts, really. Words crossed out, rewritten, abandoned halfway through sentences. Some were addressed to me, others to Samuel. "I don't know how to say this without sounding weak," one began. Another stopped abruptly after "I was wrong." I sat on the floor, back against the couch, papers spread around me like fallen leaves. I didn't feel angry reading them. I felt sad, not for myself, but for the man who had lived inside those unfinished sentences. Raymond had known, maybe not everything, but enough to understand the weight of what he'd done, enough to try, in his own imperfect way, to make amends. I placed the letters back in the folder and slid it into the drawer again. Some things don't need to be revisited again and again. They just need to be acknowledged once, then set down. A few weeks later, Clara passed away. Denise called me, her voice soft. "I thought you should know," she said. "The service is small, family only." I thanked her and hung up, then sat quietly, letting the news settle. I didn't feel compelled to go. I didn't feel obligated not to. In the end, I sent flowers with a simple card. Peace. That felt right. As the years went on, Samuel came home less often, but when he did, it felt intentional. He listened when I spoke, asked questions that showed he was still thinking about who he was, where he came from. One night, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, he said, "I don't feel angry anymore." I nodded. "That's good." "He used to think I should," he continued, "like I owed it to myself." "You don't owe pain to anyone, not even yourself." He smiled faintly. "You taught me that." I hadn't realized I had. There's a strange thing that happens when you stop trying to prove your truth. The world doesn't collapse. People don't suddenly see the light. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happens at all. But you change. You stop bracing, stop shrinking, stop replaying conversations in your head, wishing you'd said one thing differently. You stand straighter. I thought often about that afternoon in the lawyer's office, the dust motes and the careful voice reading words meant to outlive their writer. I thought about how close I'd come to believing that being doubted meant being diminished. It doesn't. Truth doesn't need witnesses to be true. It just needs time. Now, when I wake in the mornings, the silence doesn't scare me. I make my coffee slowly. I open the windows. I let the day come to me instead of rushing toward it. I've learned that some vindications arrive too late to change the past, but just in time to free the future. And that is enough. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, not by erasing them, but by placing them in the proper distance, far enough away that they no longer cut when you touch them, close enough that you still remember what they taught you. After Clara's passing, Denise and I stayed in touch. Not often, just enough. A birthday text here, a holiday card there. We never tried to rebuild something that had never truly existed between us. What we had was quieter, an understanding shaped by shared loss and unspoken regret. One spring afternoon, she called me unexpectedly. "I found something," she said. Her voice carried the weight of hesitation. "What kind of something?" I asked. "Dad's old storage unit. Mom never wanted to deal with it. I finally did." I said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. "There were boxes of papers, not important ones, personal ones." She paused. "There were pictures of Samuel." My grip tightened on the phone. "Pictures?" I repeated. "Yes, from a distance, school playgrounds, a park, one of him walking with you years ago." The room felt suddenly smaller. "He followed us?" I asked, not accusing, just trying to understand. "I think he watched," Denise said gently. "He never approached, never interfered, but he kept them." I closed my eyes. A part of me wanted to feel angry. Another part wanted to feel validated. What I felt instead was a deep, quiet sadness for a man who stood so close to the life he wanted and still couldn't step into it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Do you want them?" she asked. I thought about it, about photographs frozen in moments of a life lived without his presence. "No," I said finally. "I think they belonged to him." After we hung up, I sat for a long time, hands folded in my lap. I pictured Raymond standing across the street, pretending to check his phone while watching his son kick a ball, laugh, grow. Love doesn't always look like courage. Sometimes it looks like distance you don't know how to cross. When Samuel came home that summer, I told him, carefully, honestly. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable. "So he cared," he said at last. "Yes," I replied. "But he was afraid," Samuel said. "Yes." Samuel nodded, processing. Then he surprised me. He said, "I don't think I would have wanted him to step in," he said quietly. "Not back then. It would have been confusing." I studied him, seeing not the boy I'd raised, but the man he was becoming, thoughtful, steady, grounded. "You're allowed to feel however you feel," I said. "I know," he replied. I don't feel broken by it." Something in my chest loosened. That night, after Samuel went to bed, I stood at the sink washing dishes, the warm water running over my hands. I watched my reflection in the dark window, older now, lines etched softly around my eyes, hair threaded with silver. I looked like a woman who had lived and survived. I thought back to the moment Raymond first said the baby wasn't his, how small I'd felt, how alone, how certain I'd been that my life had cracked beyond repair. It hadn't. It had changed shape. There's a difference. Pain doesn't always ruin us. Sometimes it refines us, teaches us where our strength actually lives. Mine had lived in showing up, in choosing dignity when anger would have been easier, in holding my truth quietly when shouting it would have changed nothing. Years ago, I believed justice had to be loud to be real. I know better now. Justice can be a letter read aloud, a trust quietly honored, a child raised without bitterness, a life rebuilt without apology. On the morning Samuel left again for school, I hugged him at the door, breathing in the familiar scent of home and independence all tangled together. "I love you," I said. "I know," he replied, smiling, "and I love you too." After he drove away, I didn't cry. I stood there for a moment, then closed the door and turned back into my life, full, imperfect, honest. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing Raymond's truth to validate mine. But when it finally came, it did something unexpected. It reminded me that even broken people can leave behind something whole. And sometimes that's enough to let the past rest. Life didn't stop after all of that. It rarely does. It just kept unfolding in smaller, quieter chapters that didn't announce themselves as important until I looked back and realized how much they mattered. I retired from the library a few years later. On my last day, my coworker surprised me with a cake and a card filled with handwritten notes. As I packed up my desk, sliding old pens and bookmarks into a box, I felt a strange mix of pride and melancholy. That place had held me together during years when I wasn't sure what else would. At home, retirement meant slower mornings. I learned to let the kettle whistle before I rushed to turn it off. I read books without checking the clock. I sat by the window and watched the seasons change without feeling guilty for not being productive. Samuel called often, sometimes for advice, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to sit in comfortable silence while we both did our own things on opposite ends of the line. One evening, he told me he was thinking about becoming a father someday. "I want to do it right," he said. I smiled into the phone. "You already know what matters," I told him. Showing up, staying, listening. He was quiet for a moment. "You showed me that," he said. After we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my lap, letting that sink in. All those years I'd worried about what he was missing, what I couldn't give him because of another person's absence. And yet, here he was, whole, thoughtful, kind. One afternoon, while cleaning out the hall closet, I found a small box tucked behind winter coats. Inside were Samuel's old drawings, stick figures with oversized smiles, houses with crooked roofs, a crayon sun shining over everything. On one of them, written in careful, uneven letters, were the words, "Me and Mom." Just that. I sat on the floor and laughed softly through unexpected tears. In the quiet that followed, I thought about how many times I'd questioned myself, how many nights I'd replayed conversations with Raymond, wondering if I should have fought harder, spoken louder, demanded more. But the truth was this. I had fought, just not in the ways people recognize right away. I fought by staying gentle, by not poisoning my child's heart with bitterness, by choosing stability over spectacle, by believing myself even when no one else did. Those choices don't look dramatic from the outside. They don't make headlines or courtroom scenes, but they build something far more lasting. They build lives. Sometimes neighbors or acquaintances would ask about Samuel's father. I learned to answer simply. "He wasn't around," I'd say. That was enough, because the story was never about him in the end. It was about what grew in his absence, about what survived. On quiet evenings now, I sit on my porch and listen to the sounds of the neighborhood, laughter drifting from down the street, the low hum of passing cars, life moving along, indifferent and generous all at once. I think about that lawyer's office, the dust, the paper, the words that finally told the truth when Raymond no longer could. I think about how close I came to letting doubt define me, and I feel grateful. Not for the pain, but for the clarity that followed it. Because here's what I know now with a certainty that doesn't waver. You can be doubted and still be right. You can be denied and still be worthy. You can be abandoned and still raise something beautiful. And sometimes the truth waits patiently, gathering its strength until the moment you no longer need it to survive, but only to understand. I didn't get the apology I deserved. I didn't get the years back. I didn't get the family I imagined. What I got was something quieter, a life built on honesty, a son who knows who he is, and peace that didn't depend on anyone else's belief. And that, after everything, is more than enough. There is a moment that comes later in life. No one tells you exactly when you stop measuring time by milestones and start measuring it by meaning. I didn't notice when it happened for me. It wasn't on a birthday or an anniversary. It was a quiet afternoon, years after everything had settled, when I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain my past to myself. I was enough of an expert on my own life now. I spent more time alone, but it wasn't loneliness, it was space. Space to think, to remember without flinching, to hold moments without trying to rearrange them into something kinder than they were. Sometimes I would replay the sound of Raymond's voice in my head, not the accusations, not the coldness, but the earlier years, the way he used to clear his throat before saying something important, the way he laughed once, really laughed, when we burned a frozen pizza so badly the smoke alarm went off. People are never just one thing. That truth used to frustrate me. Now it comforts me. I began journaling, not about pain, but about patterns. I wrote about the women I'd met over the years who carried similar stories in different shapes, women who were doubted, women who were abandoned quietly without ceremony or explanation, women who kept going anyway. There were more of us than anyone ever admits. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a small community center, not as an expert, not as a survivor, but as a volunteer who'd been around long enough to have perspective. I stood at the front of a modest room, folding chairs lined up unevenly, coffee cooling in paper cups. I didn't tell my whole story. I didn't need to. I talked about dignity, about silence, about how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's fear rewrite who you are. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her eyes were tired in a way that told me she'd lived faster than she should have had to. "How did you know when to stop fighting?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "When the fight started costing me more than the peace," I said, "and when I realized the truth doesn't need defending every day, just living." She nodded slowly, like something had settled into place. That night, walking home under streetlights that flickered uncertainly, I thought about how many versions of myself had existed over the years. The woman who believed marriage meant protection, the woman who believed love could be proven, the woman who believed truth had to be loud. None of them were foolish. They were learning. And the woman I am now, she is not stronger because she endured pain. She is stronger because she chose not to pass it on. Samuel visits when he can. When he does, he brings stories of his own, of work, of friendships, of mistakes he's learning from in real time. Sometimes I see Raymond in him, and sometimes I see only Samuel, entirely his own person. That is how it should be. Once, over dinner, Samuel said something that stayed with me. "I think some people think family is about blood," he said, "that I think it's about who shows up without needing proof." I smiled at him across the table, the steam from our plates curling upward between us. "You learned that somewhere," I said. He smiled back. "Yeah, I did." Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, I stood at the sink and looked out at the darkened street. I thought about the will, about the timing of it, about how Raymond had chosen in the end to tell the truth when his voice no longer could contradict it. I don't know if that was bravery or surrender. Maybe it was both. But I know this: the truth arrived not to rescue me, but to release me. Release me from the quiet question that had followed me for years. What if I was wrong? I wasn't, and I never had been. Some lessons don't come wrapped in justice or apologies. They come wrapped in time, in distance, in the quiet certainty that settles in when you stop needing answers from people who were never capable of giving them. I don't revisit the past often now. When I do, it feels like looking at an old house from the road, recognizable, but no longer where I live. My life is here, in the quiet mornings, in the conversations that don't require defense, in the peace that comes from knowing I didn't lose myself trying to be believed. And that, I've learned, is its own kind of inheritance.